Ladies and gentlemen, as the chairman of the board of directors, I'm honored to welcome you to the Cleveland Council on World Affairs second Global Impact Award dinner. We are proud to honor Mr. Strobe Talbott with our Global Impact Award and as the Brooks Emeny Distinguished Speaker for tonight. Thank you. Thank you for coming and being among the big family in Cleveland. This event is meant to highlight the Council's mission and to reinforce the Council's commitment to international understanding, education, and peace. We have provided a summary of the work of the Council at each of your places on the tables. I hope you will take a few minutes to review the growing impact of the Council in Northeast Ohio. I encourage you to join the Council and become one of our members and attend our functions and participate in all our activities. Around the turbulent times of the Second World War, the Council was fortunate to be led by Mr. Brooks Emeny, an Ohioan, a graduate and scholar of Princeton and Yale. He joined the Council in 1935 and led the Council for 12 years. He was prolific in his writings and activism. Mr. Emeny established the Cleveland Committee on Foreign Relations. He hosted a major international convention in Cleveland in 1947, generating a report called A Report to the World. This work evolved into the Marshall Plan for Europe 5 months later. This was a very big convention, international convention with foreign ministers from several countries right after the Second World War. Mr. Emeny called on the people of Cleveland and Ohio to stay engaged in political life and international affairs. Mr. Emeny inspired our community with his leadership, vision, and energy. He challenged our generosity and dedication by his endowed support of the Council. Tonight, we honor Brooks Emeny's memory with Mr. Talbott's delivery of the Emeny Distinguished Lecture. Our core functions include active speakers programs, about 20 events a year, hosting scholars, journalists, and ambassadors on relevant international issues. We had Kofi Annan, we had Lech Walesa, we had Mr. Brzezinski, we had John Bolton, we had Tom Pickering. We had hosts of great ambassadors to major countries of the world. Our second program, the Model UN program in schools, reached out to thousands of students and teachers over the years. I'm very sure that many of your kids went through that program. Our third program, the International Visitors Program, hosts over 250 international professionals sponsored by the State Department to interact with their counterparts and the Cleveland community. We collaborate with distinguished organizations in the city, academic, corporations, and foundations, and we like to expand these collaborations in the future. I want to recognize our CCWA President, Ambassador Heather Hodges. Heather, she's a Clevelander and she's been doing a great job. We were lucky to have her. And our Executive Director, Mrs. Maura O'Donnell McCarthy, and the staff for their contributions to our success. Maura, where are you? Stand up. Stand up. I want to thank the Council board members for their dedication, guidance, and vision and support over the years of the Council. I want to extend a personal and collective appreciation and gratitude to Mr. Richard Pogue, our distinguished board member, who has twice chaired this event. You all know Dick. Dick's incredible leadership combined with his strong personal engagement, has made this a sellout event 2 years in a row. Thank you, Dick, from all of us. I also want to recognize the support from the Cleveland Foundation, our presenting sponsor. Thank you for your leadership support. Thank you for being the engine of the Cleveland Renaissance. You will hear from Mr. Ron Richard, president of the Cleveland Foundation, when he introduces Mr. Talbott. Our diplomat sponsors, as well as our table sponsors, are listed in the program. Special acknowledgement to our diplomat sponsors, Mr. Charles Bolton, the Cleveland Clinic Foundation, Cleveland State University, Forest City, and the Koulas Foundation. Thank you for your generous support. Thank you to all the members of the planning and hosting committees, as well as the board and staff members for their work on this event. And of course, I would like to thank all of you for being here and making this event successful. We owe it to our greater Cleveland region to make it a better place for international understanding, education, and peace for generations to come. It's our mission, and we hope you join us. Please enjoy your dinner. Following dinner, Mr. Dick Pogue will come to the podium to begin the program.
Ladies and gentlemen, please continue finishing your meal and the dessert that's being placed in front of you. I'd like to add my welcome to Wales earlier this evening. It's just wonderful to see all of you here. It's a great support for the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, and just absolutely fabulous to be able to honor one of our own from Cleveland, Strobe Talbott. As I was preparing for this evening, somebody asked me, how many years have you been a member of the Cleveland Council on World Affairs? And when you get old enough, people ask you that question. But I did a little research and found that I joined the council in 1958, which is, I think, 56 years. So I paid my dues. But the reason I mention that is that when I was a young lawyer, I could see that the Cleveland Council on World Affairs was a great opportunity to meet other people that had an interest in the world about them, and over the years have met many people who had a similar interest in foreign affairs and the international relationships that we have here in Cleveland. And the council is an ideal organization, in my view, for getting together people that want to learn more and be active in the international field. So I think it's just a fabulous part of the Cleveland scene. I've had the very good fortune to know Strobe Talbott, and I knew his late father, Bud, extremely well over many, many years. And we're so delighted that Strobe has agreed to come back here to his hometown to speak to us this evening. And the person who's going to introduce him is Ron Richard, who, as you know, is the CEO and president of the Cleveland Foundation, our presenting sponsor this evening. Ron came to Cleveland in 2003. He came back to Cleveland, I should say, because his origins were here. But he came here as president of the Cleveland Foundation after holding a variety of important positions in government, in the private sector, and in the nonprofit service. So he's had a wonderful, broad experience, much of it touching on the international arena. At the Cleveland Foundation, I think everyone would agree that he's done a marvelous job, very innovative, indeed transformational in his 11 years here. And as you've heard, he's in charge of the foundation during a very seminal period. This is their 100th birthday in 2014. And I think, as you all also know, the Cleveland Foundation was the first community foundation in the world, and there are now about 1,800 of them that basically follow the Cleveland Foundation model all over the world. It's quite a story. Early in his career, Ron was a U.S. diplomat serving as American Consulate General in Osaka and Kobe, Japan, and also had other assignments at the State Department. He had 13 years at Matsushita, I can't ever pronounce it, but thank you, Panasonic. And spent quite a bit of time as head of the North American Research and Development Operations, which taught him about the importance of research and achievement and the need to continue to plow on when things sometimes at first look a little daunting. Immediately prior to joining the foundation, he was managing director and chief operating officer of In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA's venture capital fund. And in this role, he worked very hard to ensure that there would be prompt and effective and efficient delivery of technology into and for the benefit of the U.S. intelligence continuity. So Ron, we thank you very much for being with us here tonight to introduce our speaker, and would you come up and start your comments?
Thank you so much, Dick. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you? I want to especially say good evening to the wonderful members of the board of the council who give their time so generously. Thank you for your work for the community. I'm delighted to be here representing the Cleveland Foundation, and we're very delighted to be the presenting sponsor for tonight's Global Impact Award program. We've brought along a few friends who exemplify the Foundation's global outreach. I want you to know that in the audience are fellows and alumni of the German Marshall Fund, which is a steadfast partner of the Cleveland Foundation for 40 years. We administer that program in Cleveland. Would you like to take a bow? And visiting artists from Creative Fusion. Creative Fusion is an international artist in residency program that the Cleveland Foundation started many years ago to bring artists from all over the world to Cleveland to spend a fair amount of time here and working with students in high schools, colleges, etc. And tonight we have our fall class. We have artists in residence from Chile, Nepal, South Africa, and Taiwan. And would you please stand so we can thank you? And they're wonderful artists, so you'll have a chance to see their work, I'm sure. The Cleveland Foundation, as Dick mentioned, was the first community foundation in the world. And as you may have heard, this year we've been celebrating our centennial. It's been wonderful for us. 100 years dedicated to enhancing the lives of Greater Clevelanders through grant making and leadership on key community issues. But also, as Dick mentioned, Cleveland was just the beginning. The spark that Frederick Harris Goff, our founder, started here in Cleveland spread to 1,827 community foundations around the world. But just 9 years after our founding in 1914, the Cleveland Council on World Affairs came together to keep Greater Cleveland citizens informed about international relations. How forward-looking was that? Today, the world is at our doorstep. Sometimes that's wonderful. We have wonderful multiculturalism, wonderful artists, wonderful, cultural offerings, but we also have war, disease, terrorism, economic difficulties. So now more than ever, global issues really have a profound effect on every one of us, whether we like it or not. I feel deeply privileged to introduce tonight's honoree, who really doesn't need my introduction, but first, as a former career Foreign Service officer, of course, I'm always honored to introduce a former American ambassador and Deputy Secretary of State. Second, Strobe Talbott is president of the Brookings Institution. one of the world's most influential, most prestigious public policy organizations, and an organization I have a special fondness for because when I attended graduate school right across the street from Brookings at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, I looked out the SAIS library and saw Brookings for every night for 2 years. Strobe's distinguished career spans journalism, government, and academia. The common denominator is that he's always worked to foster global dialogue, cooperation, and understanding. Strobe is founding director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. Earlier, as I mentioned, he served in the State Department, first as ambassador at large and special advisor to the Secretary of State for the new independent states of the former Soviet Union. A very important post, obviously, and then, of course, as Deputy Secretary of State. Strobe entered government service after 21 years with Time magazine, where he reported on Eastern Europe, the State Department, and the White House. He then served as Time's Washington bureau chief, editor-at-large, and foreign affairs columnist. He was twice awarded the Edward Weintal, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Prize for Distinguished Diplomatic Reporting. In 2011, Strobe was named to chair the U.S. State Department's Foreign Affairs Policy Board. In 2007 and 2008, he served on the National Commission on War Powers. He's also been a fellow of the Yale Corporation, a trustee of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a director of the Council on Foreign Relations, the North American Executive Committee of the Trilateral Commission, and the American Association of Rhodes Scholars. Yes, he was also a Rhodes Scholar. In case you wondered, he's authored 12 books and has written for such prestigious media outlets as Foreign Affairs, The New Yorker, The Economist, The Financial Times, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and Slate. And aren't you glad that I decided to cut his resume way down and just pick the most important highlights? On a personal note, Strobe's late father, Bud Talbott, was a very dear friend of mine. Maybe the only person in Cleveland as fanatically environmentalist as I am. So we had a special bond. I felt and feel the greatest respect and affection for him, and I miss him terribly. Every day he worked in our building, so I'd see him a lot. And the elevator lobby just doesn't seem the same when I'm not bumping into Bud. But I can say that certainly the apple did not fall far from the tree with Bud's boy. So Strobe and Dick, will you please come up so we can present you with your award?
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So now Strobe will share his views on a very timely topic, America's role in a changing world. Thank you.
Ron, thank you very much. I cannot tell you how moving it has been for me to be back home these last several hours, and particularly since this lovely reception convened and so many people came up to me and made me feel very much back at home. This town was home to my folks since 1952, and the room is full of people who knew them and loved them, and they sure loved you back. And this is a particularly poignant moment for me because it's the first time I've been back since the wonderful memorial service for Bud. I want to also underscore how much the council meant to both Bud and to Joe. I don't think they go back to 1958, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was around that time. They were citizens of Cleveland. They were boosters of Cleveland. I'm really, really, really sorry that Bud didn't have a chance to see the Browns come back against the Titans last Sunday. Because I'll tell you, there was a ritual, a rather melancholy ritual much of the time, when he and I would get on the phone with each other late on a Sunday evening, and I'd be bewailing the fate of the Redskins, and he'd be you-know-what. In any event, it was a great win last week. And I also want to thank Heather, who picked me up at the airport this afternoon and gave me a kind of a quick tour of what's so obvious, and that is that I know that the old sign, the best location in the nation, isn't out there anymore, but this city is obviously coming back. And I know that there are many, many people here in the room tonight who can take credit and pride in that. And Ron, you very much on that list. And Wael, thank you for a chance to get to know you. And wherever Liz is, she's also been very helpful to me, even found me a 15-minute period where I could take a little nap this afternoon. And then she came in and woke me up to say my office was on her cell phone line. So I had to go back to work for a while. When Dick Pogue and I don't know how many months ago it was, probably 6 or 7 months ago, were talking about this evening and setting a date for it, there was already plenty of trouble around the globe, and therefore we decided to pick a topic that would kind of leave us some flexibility for whatever was in the headlines at the time, but we thought that it should be a topic with a somewhat minor key, and that's how we came up with America's role in an unsettled world. Now, since then, the world has gotten a lot more unsettled. In the Middle East, just when the United States is trying to pull up stakes, it's re-engaging again with an enemy most of us hadn't even heard of a year ago. And we're still not sure what to call it. In fact, the New York Times isn't even sure what to call it. And yet it is a major preoccupation, not just for our government, but for governments all around the world. And it's in that same strategically vital and it seems almost historically cursed region that the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians has broken down, casting a dark cloud over the prospect and what seems to all of us, I think, to be the obvious solution of a two-state solution to that conflict. And then to the north of that troubled area, on the other side of the Black Sea, Russia is gobbling up Ukrainian territory and threatening other neighboring states. In the Far East, China is intimidating and alienating its neighbors and flexing its muscles in worrisome ways at the United States. And that's not all. And my dad would very much want me to add the following. Mother Nature herself is shaking us by the scruff of our necks with reminders that she can turn against globalization and civilization itself if we do not respect her paradoxical combination of power and fragility. In Africa, the equatorial Eden of our species, there is a pandemic that could quite literally kill entire states, notably including, of course, Liberia, and also turn failing states into failed states and fragile states into failing states. And then at the top of the world, what all of us grew up thinking of as the polar ice cap is rapidly becoming the polar sea. There's a great melting going on that augurs international competition and conflict, threats to biodiversity and indigenous people, and the swamping of cities around the world. Taken together, these regional crises constitute a global crisis. They're impeding the international community's ability to blunt threats that can only be dealt with cooperatively, climate change being the preeminent example. And that's still not all. There's one big problem that I've saved for last, and it goes to the topic for the evening. America, the country of many of us here in the room, but not all, and I think it's terrific that this is a global audience tonight. America is underperforming in its role as the natural leader of this unsettled world. That's partly because American democracy is so polarized and dysfunctional. It's hard to lead the world when you're in gridlock over how to govern your own country. And that's our condition today. No wonder polls show Americans to be in deep doldrums about their future and about the state of the world. That's not surprising, given how we have been pummeled with bad news from all over, not just from Erbil and Gaza City and Donetsk and Monrovia and the South China Sea, but from Washington as well. Now, those hotspots and the issues that are flaring around the world are all worthy of discussion. And if your patience permits and time permits, I'd be glad to enter into at least a short conversation with those of you who want to make some comments and ask some questions. But first, I want to concentrate in these remarks on a reflection on how today's widespread pessimism about the state of the world is rooted not just in the here and now, but also in a preoccupation with the state of the world 100 years ago. As 2014 has unfolded, we've been constantly reminded by bestsellers on the nonfiction lists, highbrow TV talk shows, Sunday review essays, and no doubt speakers at podiums like this one, that this is the centenary of the beginning of World War I, and that today's headlines resonate ominously with those of 100 years ago. As this past summer came to an end, it was all too easy to imagine the guns of August booming in the South China Sea or over the Senkaku Islands, or a Sarajevo moment in eastern Ukraine, a shot that might have been heard around the world. When the Malaysian airliner Flight 17 was downed, it was compared in a number of articles and television shows to a potential analog to the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, my own view is that this particular theme has been overdone. I think we're making too much of what is really an accident of the calendar. The theme of 2014 as 1914 redux is not really helping us to understand what's happening and what to do about it. I would suggest that there are actually other, more recent periods that are more relevant and more useful to getting a grip on what's going on now. So let's, for a few minutes, drop the conventional wisdom that the threshold months before World War I, in which our grandfathers and great-grandfathers fought, were an omen for our own time. Let's instead look at today's world against the backdrop of our own lifetimes. And when I say our lifetimes, I'm thinking particularly of the lifetimes of those of us who qualify as baby boomers, which takes us back to the end of World War II, in which Lieutenant Bud Talbott fought in the North Atlantic and at Normandy. If we do that, the tough tasks that we face now may appear no less real, but they will, I hope, look less apocalyptic, and we can be less despairing about our ability to take on those tasks. So with that historical perspective, here are several points to keep in mind. First, we've got to remember that roiled and troubled and unsettled as the world is today, it's not as bad or as perilous as the Cold War was, not by a long shot. Those of us who were kids in the 1950s remember duck and cover drills. That ring a bell? I remember them more clearly than anything else from my days at Fairmont Elementary School in Cleveland Heights, where some of you may have been my classmates. Even then, as a 10-year-old, I couldn't quite believe that crouching in a fetal position below our desks was going to save us from a Soviet H-bomb targeted on the terminal tower. And as for that other giant of communism, let's remember too that back then we were not wary of China because of its rise as a competitive economic superpower that was exporting iPhones and solar panels to the rest of the world. Rather, we were wary of China because it was in the grip of a fanatical dictator who was exporting revolution and who was gleeful at the prospect of global thermonuclear war because more Chinese would survive than Americans. Another point, those 40 years after the end of World War II are sometimes invoked today as the halcyon days of American superpower, the acme of American leadership and of American grand strategy. Well, I would suggest that that's a rather rosy rearview mirror. For one thing, the grand strategy of those decades, containment, was indeed simple and compelling. But that was because there was essentially only one great enemy, and that was the communist monolith. Yet the simplicity and the single-mindedness of U.S. strategy came at a price. We tended to overlook parts of the world that didn't figure in the Cold War. And in the so-called Third World, we tended to support anti-communist dictators whose eventual downfall played to our disadvantage. Moreover, we should remember that Uncle Sam, armed as he was with a doomsday arsenal and a bumper sticker doctrine, often didn't get his way. There were plenty of setbacks and humiliations. In 1949, we lost China. A year later, we were set back on our heels in Korea and had to settle eventually for a draw. In 1956, we did nothing except protest when Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest and crushed the revolution of the Hungarian people. And I'll never forget, as long as I live, how the Hungarian American community here in Cleveland reacted to that episode. In '57, we were out on our lawns watching as Sputnik blinked across the night sky, and our government told us that the rocket that had boosted Sputnik into orbit could also hurl a multi-megaton warhead at us. In 1959, we lost Cuba. In 61, a showdown over Berlin brought us close to the brink of World War III. And then a year later, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought us even closer. In 68, we were pretty much helpless when the Soviets snuffed out the Prague Spring. In 74, we lost Vietnam. In 79, we lost Iran. The list could go on. But the point is, let's not stoke our gloom over the state of the world today by pining for the good old days when America bestrode the world like a colossus, getting its way and stomping on its enemies. That may be the memory, but it isn't the facts. The facts are more complicated, insofar as they remind us that the world is always unsettled. They might help us deal with the knotty issues today and not despair of those. A third point about the Cold War. Our domestic politics during those decades were in some ways at least as roiled, divisive, and toxic as they are today. Remember the 1950s, when McCarthyism and the blacklists trammeled our Constitution. Remember the 60s, when Vietnam, a hot front of the Cold War, tore our country apart. I'm thinking particularly of Kent State. Bottom line, we can be glad that we survived what John F. Kennedy called the long twilight struggle. We can be grateful to all of our presidents, from Harry Truman to George H.W. Bush, for getting us through it. But we shouldn't feel even a twinge of nostalgia for the Cold War. Now let's reflect a little bit on the post-Cold War period. That was a time of high hopes and great opportunities. I remember meeting with the council during that period. I was in the State Department at the time. The topic, the speech, the discussion, the overall mood of the evening was much more upbeat than today's conditions allow us to be tonight. No wonder. The Berlin Wall, the Iron Curtain, and the Warsaw Pact, along with the evil empire itself, had all come crashing down. The homelands of many Clevelanders, Ukraine, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, the Baltics, were no longer captive nations. Their post-communist governments were knocking on the door of NATO and of the European Union and would soon be admitted. Russia itself had given up its reliance on the big lie and the iron fist, and it was suing for peace in the Cold War, substituting partnership for confrontation. The leaders in the Kremlin, whose predecessors regarded the world as a global ideological and geopolitical battlefield, accepted instead the reality of globalization and the imperative of making a virtue out of international interdependence. NATO and the European Union expanded eastward into what had been the Warsaw Pact and the USSR, and as a result, an additional 100 million Europeans today are part of what has often been called the political West. Since the Cold War had been a global schism, its end sparked a boom in international integration and cooperation worldwide throughout the 90s and into the first decade of this century. The G8 and the G20 came into being as the closest thing we've ever had to a board of directors of the world, one that brought together established powers and rising ones like China, Brazil, and Turkey. Moreover, the working premise of those and similar institutions was that globalization can benefit all nations that are prepared to observe certain rules and collaborate in dealing with global issues. As for the United Nations, and there was reference earlier this evening to Kofi Annan, during the 90s, Secretary General Annan proclaimed and exercised, put into fact, what he called responsibility to protect vulnerable populations from brutal dictatorships. And that policy was put particularly to the test in the Balkans. Post-Soviet Russia was part of the solution to that problem. Its diplomatic efforts were crucial in bringing peace to Bosnia and Kosovo, thus ending the first outbreak of real genocide in Europe since World War II. These favorable developments, the strengthening and broadening of international institutions, the cultivation of salutary habits and norms of international conduct, took root over a period of more than 2 decades, the closing years of the 20th century and the opening years of the 21st. Then came a series of setbacks over the last 6 years. A continuation of negative trends that has slowed the momentum of the previous positive ones, and in some cases reversed those positive trends. A major precipitating event was the financial earthquake with its epicenter on Wall Street that shook the world starting in 2008. The global recession has had multiple very, very deleterious consequences. It's hobbled developed countries in their ability to advance economic integration. It's devastated fragile states that were just beginning to get their feet on the ground. It crashed job markets, particularly job markets affecting the global youth bulge. It exacerbated income inequality and inequality in opportunity. And it hindered progress in world trade. Finally, it called into question whether globalization itself is A, beneficial, and B, governable. The consequences have not just been economic. The disillusionment and economic pain that came with the Great Recession has triggered a worldwide crisis of trust and confidence in governments, governing institutions, governing elites, and governing systems. And that applies, when you think about it, to every single category of governance there is on the planet. Parliamentary democracy, state capitalism, monarchy, and theocracy. They're all suffering from this crisis. And it certainly applies to our own country. The Tea Party and the Occupy movement were both nurtured by the aftermath of the Lehman Brothers debacle. Pretty much ever since then, the federal government's approval rating has been in the low single digits. And the consequences of the global recession have also been geopolitical. And that's no surprise, because throughout history, especially in the last century, we've seen how a bad global economy can lead to bad politics, namely nationalism, which in turn lead to bad policies, namely protectionism, and really bad geopolitics, namely aggression and expansionism. We've seen all of that in the last few years. And we're seeing it right now, most notably in Ukraine, with the return of a scourge from the 19th and early 20th centuries. A big power bullying and occupying a smaller power on the principle that ethnicity can and should be the basis of statehood. The conceit that blood ties are stronger than international borders, an insidious proposition that almost inevitably leads to bloodshed. This is a throwback not to the origins of World War I, but to the origins of World War II. In particular, it's a page out of the book of the late 1930s, when Germany annexed the Sudetenland in a glaring and eerie precedent for Russia's literal annexation of Crimea and its virtual annexation of eastern Ukraine. Now, as we all know, this has been a big and vexing problem for the world, for the West, and for the United States. But it's one that I believe we, the U.S., and our transatlantic allies are dealing with appropriately. And with strategic resolve, I think it's a problem that we will be able to deal with successfully as well. I believe that not just because of my own confidence in our system with all of its faults. It has a lot of resilience, and it's based on sound core virtues and values. But it's also because of my near certainty that the policies and strategies of Vladimir Putin are going to fail. Maybe in the middle term, certainly in the long term. Why am I so certain of that? It's because Putin has reinstated precisely the policies and the system that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. They are even less likely to succeed in the 21st century than they were in the 20th. Russia's only hope, I believe, is to have Putinism basically play itself out and then have the country return to the reformist path that it was on for nearly a quarter of a century. Now, full disclosure here. My optimism on this score puts me at odds with others, many of whom I know and respect very well, who have spent much of their lives, as have I, trying to understand Russia. Quite a few people of that description believe that what might be called Russia's pivot to the West, starting in the late 80s and now clearly over, was an aberration, and that what we're calling Putinism is actually Russia's natural and fated condition. The debate between those folks and myself might be summarized this way. They believe that Russia is a prisoner of its authoritarian and imperialistic history and its authoritarian political culture. Whereas I believe Russia was liberated from that prison by a combination of its own people and its reformist leaders, and crucially, the external circumstances of globalization itself. That is, one reason that Russia was able to throw off the yoke of the past was the gravitational force of an increasingly integrated world that pulled Russia out of its isolation. That's a more salient debate than whether 2014 is a replay of 1914, or for that matter, 1938. I would make a similar point regarding the other great preoccupying challenge of the day, one that Wael and I talked about during the reception. And that is the rise of non-state actors as villains on the world stage, particularly in the Middle East. Now, we in this country had our own wake-up call to that phenomenon on 9/11, when an obscure terrorist network found a way to do our nation terrible harm by combining the most primitive tool imaginable, a box cutter, with the iconic technology of globalization itself, a Boeing airliner, and also attaching those two to an obscurantist, homicidal, suicidal ideology. And here we are, 13 years later, and once again, almost out of the blue, we discover that Al-Qaeda has spawned a diabolical non-state actor that actually claims to be a state and that is threatening to occupy and conquer the territory of other states. Now that phenomenon is not, like Putinism, a throwback to the 1930s. Rather, ISIS is a throw way back to the Middle Ages, to the era of conquering tribes that swept back and forth across the steppes of Central Asia, Anatolia, the Arabian Peninsula, and North Africa. ISIS is quite simply bent not just on brutalizing and demodernizing the Arab world, it's bent on decivilizing the cradle of civilization itself. The threat posed by radical political Islam is particularly complicated and arduous as a test for our mixture of hard power, soft power, and smart power, because it's burgeoning in a region where most of the established states are either failing or weak or dictatorial or themselves radicalized. So there's no simple formula for dealing with this situation quickly, nor can it be solved by military means alone. But there is reason to believe that it can, over time, be dealt with, and it's essentially the same reason for long-term optimism about Russia. ISIS and its sister monstrosities are, like Putin's Russia, trying to make an ugly past a model for what will be an ugly future if they succeed. But they won't succeed. Their goal will not be able to withstand the forces of a well-governed, globalized world. But that means that the world has to meet that standard. It's going to have to restore the progress and momentum in the direction of being well-governed that was so heartening in the 1990s, but has in recent years stalled out. And restoring that momentum is going to put a huge onus on the United States of America. It's going to require us, the only country on earth that can exercise true global leadership, to get its own act together by fixing its own crisis in governance. And that means putting civility back into our political discourse, bipartisanship back into our politics, and efficacy back into our institutions. That's a tall order, to be sure, but it's not an impossible one, especially, and I'm looking at all of you and the institution that you represent, civic organizations like this one around the country can make the advancement of those goals a major part of their mission, which is to say, your mission. You've already done that here in Cleveland, and as I said at the outset, that makes me very, very proud to be a Clevelander and a Browns fan. Thank you. Have we got a few minutes, 5 minutes, something like that?
Some questions?
Or refutations? Yes. And I hope some of our global participants will also join in here. No is the answer. Europe has a problem of governance more serious by far than ours. The European project, the dream of earlier generations of Europeans, particularly Jean Monnet, that Europe would evolve into a transnational governed space, it's self stalled out. And by the way, I think that problem was itself at least accelerated by the global recession. But I do think, not least because of leadership of people like Draghi, over the next couple of years, we might see Europe get its mojo back, the European Union itself, but it's going to have to start with getting the economics right. In the meantime, the onus is going to be largely on the United States to take the lead, both with Russia, and that means sanctions, which are very, very hard for the Europeans to participate in, but so far so good. It may mean lethal defensive armaments to the Kyiv government if the ceasefire is broken, which is very likely. And as for ISIS and all of that, while President Obama is determined not to have boots on the ground, we'll just have to see how long we can do it from the air, but it's going to have to be American force. Yes? I haven't read the book, but I did read the New York Times summary of Leon Panetta's book. I think it was, it related to ISIS, but it had more to do with the response to the catastrophe in Syria itself. And as the world now knows, because pretty much all of the principals have confirmed it, there was a pretty powerful phalanx of the president's cabinet officers and advisors urging that the United States take a much more robust position in support of the so-called rebels, and particularly the moderate rebels in Syria, and the president decided not to do that. I was part of a small group that had dinner with the president about 3 weeks ago, Monday. And on that subject, he was emphatic in saying that he does not regret his decision. He has never understood why those on the other side of the argument felt that we had a clear enough idea of who the moderates were. And I think it can be an argument over counterfactuals. That is to say, if we had done X instead of doing Y, would it be better? What I think is unquestionably true is that the president made a number of more than just tactical and political mistakes, certainly describing what was going to be a red line and then moving the red line, conditioning his willingness to use force on the support of Congress, and he did that immediately after Prime Minister Cameron had his head handed to him in the Parliament. It was almost as though our president said, well, I want one of those too, which doesn't make a lot of sense. I think it was a low point in what has been overall a foreign policy that is better than it's credited for, but I think that has been a very, very tough episode. In a way, of course, one of the few points of agreement we've had with Russia got us out of that problem, at least up to a point, with regard to getting the chemical weapons out of the hands of the Assad regime. But of course, now that ISIS is in the picture, it is going to be even harder to use political, not to mention military means, of stopping Assad from the slaughter of the rebels. So this ISIS, while of course it's aimed against the Assad regime, is giving space for Assad to strengthen his own position. It is a mess. Yes. Let me take the latter first because because you provided your own answer to it. China's influence in Africa is stunning, and this is just the latest demonstration of that. With regard to, I think the special relationship between the United States and the UK is okay, but two things are going to be required, I think, to sustain it over the long haul. One is that the UK remain the UK, if you know what I mean. This was while it was a 10-point margin in the Scottish referendum, it was still pretty hairy, and it's not over. And of course, there's now talk of sort of copycat devolution, if not more than devolution elsewhere, including in England itself. So if Great Britain becomes one of the poster childs for what is a very disturbing trend in Europe right now, and that is instead of integration, there's disintegration. You've got Catalonia and the Basque Country and in Spain, then that is going to be, it's going to be very hard for the United States to sustain the relationship, and for the British government as well. The other thing is where Britain comes out on the EU. If this triple bet that Cameron has made does not pay off, and if the UK basically leaves the EU, it'll not only be bad for the EU, but the United States has a huge stake in the EU getting its mojo back. And if the UK is a big part of setting that back, it'll put a real dent in the relationship, I think. Yes?
Could you please share your thoughts on cyber terrorism?
Yeah, I will, not least because the outfit that I work for deals with it every single day, as do many companies in this country, and particularly those companies and NGOs that pay a lot of attention to China. I wouldn't call it, when you say terrorism, I'm thinking more of cybersecurity writ large. This is a classic case of modernization. New technologies come along, and they create both great opportunities and unsolved problems. Our ability to regulate new technologies, like the internet, is a slow process. And yet, because the technology is so powerful, there are all kinds of ways in which you can get around corners. You can basically leapfrog over existing regulations. And there's another dilemma too, and that is in the realm of cybersecurity, pretty much every country that has the capacity to use cyber attacks and cyber for purposes of intelligence gathering is going to want to hold its own capacity invulnerable to either regulation or interference from other countries, but those same countries are going to want to have everybody else governed, everybody else regulated. So it's a big challenge for Dick Pogue's profession and our governments, lawyers.
Over here.
Excuse me.
Yes.
What are the 3 highest priority action items you would have the U.S. do right now?
There is, when you say right now, I guess if we're really talking about specifics, one is to make sure that the sanctions which are in effect against Russia and are under some strain in the transatlantic relationship remain in effect and are not lifted before the Russian Federation truly reverses its course in Ukraine, which I think is going to be a long time. In other words, we have to maintain solidarity with our allies to keep those sanctions in place. If we don't, this will be a big win for Putin, and the phenomenon he represents will probably be around a lot longer. The other, of course, is ISIS, and I would hope that the President will find ways of getting the coalition, which is impressive in its size, impressive in the number of countries that have signed up to it, but not terribly impressive yet in what other countries are willing to do to help defeat ISIS. The one example I'll give you is Turkey. Turkey is trying to play multiple sides of this because of its own Kurdish problem, and the President is working very, very hard to bring Erdogan along, and he has similar challenges with others in the region and with the Europeans. Maybe you wouldn't be disappointed with me if I didn't end with the third point being climate change, but my father certainly would be disappointed. So let's get going on that one too. Anyway, thank you very much.
Just one final quick word. Thank you very much. And actually, this is mostly to thank some very important people in tonight's event. First of all, Dick Pogue for chairing the steering committee and for all the people that served on that steering committee. Liz Horrigan, who did a terrific job of organizing all of this. We couldn't have done it without her. Yenny Carney of CCWA staff was also right behind Liz and working closely with her. And Maura O'Donnell McCarthy, our executive director, was very important. Cleveland Foundation and Ron Richard, thank you so much for being our sponsoring, our presenting sponsor. And finally, Strobe, thank you so much for coming. You've taken us around the world tonight, both historically and in our world today, and you have left us with so much to think about both tonight and for many months to come, and we really appreciate your having come here tonight. And then finally, thank you to all of you who are so interested in world affairs, who have supported us over the years. And we hope to see you at future events and to continue having your support. You know, maybe even just meeting with some of our foreign visitors coming to our speaker events or whatever. But we truly appreciate it. This is a very important institution for Cleveland, and we're